This video is going to be about overall planning and pacing block length going into meet day. And if you guys watched the tier list video that myself and Andrew Salant just made earlier this month, the timing of blocks and the development of those relative to meet day, we actually ranked really low on that tier list. But that was a tier list specifically about the variables that have to do with programming and progression related to programming for the average powerlifter, right? How important are certain things from a programming perspective specifically? However, we're going to be talking about peaking going into meet day. This is a far different story, and in my opinion, lining things up and timing multiple blocks going into meet day is extremely important. And arguably, if we were to make another tier list specifically about peaking, which honestly I wouldn't be surprised if we do, this would be in the S tier 100%, because more often than not, coaches are not taking this into account in the sense that once an athlete signs up for a meet, it is probably in their best interest, unless it's, there's a point of diminishing returns where you can only plan so far ahead of time. But once an athlete signs up for a meet, you've got to make sure the timing of their blocks actually align with meet day. So what exactly do I mean by that, right? Going into a meet, it's very important that we keep predictability high, that there's no surprise beyond that. The worst feeling ever is when you've got a meet prep that lines up with a week 2 or a week 3 of a block, and you don't realize until you're about to write the last block of someone's meet prep, right? In order to avoid that, we have got to time things out ahead of time to make sure the regular pacing, regular timing of these lifters' blocks line up with meet day, okay? So I got a few points here that I want to mention, but again, the whole premise here is really just how do we line up blocks with meet day? Because we do not want meet day to land on an absolutely random day of someone's training. If we want to heighten predictability, we need to intentionally peak into meet day. There's multiple ways to do that. However, in this example, I'm going to be using 4 athletes that and they'll all be training into meet day, right? All 4 of these athletes are going to be training into meet day. So I have a whole YouTube video on what that exactly means. However, the whole idea here and why I picked these 4 lifters is because they've already got the timing of their meet prep planned out going into the meet itself, and they're all going to be training into the meet. And the reason I picked athletes with that demographic is because when we train into the meet, the final day of someone's meet prep is going to be meet day. Like, it's just going to be another training day essentially, and we are not going to be tacking on an additional taper week to that. The additional taper week is going to be another week tacked onto the timing of things, and I thought that would make it a little bit more confusing for the sake of this video. But to be honest with you, I don't even have anyone peeking into meets like that anymore. I don't think, maybe 1 or 2 people, but regardless, that's besides the point. The whole point of this video is to emphasize how can we actually plan and time lifters' blocks going into a meet day ahead of time to heighten predictability on the day itself. So I got 4 bullet points I want to talk about before I actually get into these brief case studies themselves. The first one is, if block timing does not work out in your favor and we need to adjust 1 block or 2 blocks, probably just 1, I would prefer to get that odd block out of the way ASAP. And like I just mentioned, we're trying to really heighten predictability going into a meet. When we need to alter block length, we are stripping from the predictability that we would have on meet day otherwise. So we really, in my opinion, need to take that odd block and just get it out of the way sooner rather than later. And that brings me to my next point. Block length is part of overall predictability, right? Again, in these cases where we're going to be lining up the final day of someone's prep and they're training with the day of a meet, that is a measure of predictability, and we need we are doing that essentially to get meet day predictable. It all just kind of cycles around predictability, right? Because that's what we're trying to do here, trying to heighten predictability as much as we possibly can on meet day relative to predictable training. So block length is part of that, and we want that to be as high as possible on the platform. So that's a big reason why we're doing this in the first place, because like I mentioned, we don't want a random training day to be meet day. We don't want a random week 2 or something like that to just happen to be on meet day, and we don't catch that until right before the meet. That's a really bad feeling, and I prefer to really time things out sooner rather than later. Third point, is when we are closer to a meet, I would personally prefer to extend a block a little bit as opposed to create a shorter block or multiple shorter blocks. There are going to be times when creating multiple shorter blocks is the way to go, but specifically when we are closer to a meet, I would prefer we get normal pacing going into meet day. So that specifically last 1 or 2 blocks, I really would like to be the lifter's normal block length. Here's an example to help kind of paint the picture here. If someone is 6 weeks out from a meet, let's say the lifter signs up for the meet 6 weeks out, so we don't have much time to plan ahead. So the lifter signs up for a meet 6 weeks out, and they run 5 week blocks. Okay, I would prefer to tack an additional week to the beginning of that 5 week block, and then just run like a 5 week block with an intro week or a 6 week block, if we want to call it that, as the one block going into meet day, as opposed to doing 2 3 week blocks that are really short and we probably need to take more aggressive weekly jumps going into meet day. I would prefer to tack an additional week on that and slightly extend things as opposed to shorten things and have it be 2 3 week blocks in that example. And the last thing, and this is a bit more case dependent, but when an athlete has 2 meets that are close together, and I have one lifter that I'm about to explain where this is the case. When an athlete has 2 meets that are close together, I would prefer that first post-meet block to be the normal block length as well, just so we're not getting right back into training with a unpredictable block length, if that makes sense. So in the 4 examples I have, my first example is going to be my lifter Jake, and he's going to be the easiest example, and this is partially why I put him in here, just because it's really easy to view and understand, okay? Jake is competing on July 12th, and he told me he signed up for that meet around March, I believe, like the block prior to this first block here that I have written out. So we timed things right into meet day right away. It was pretty simple. We did not need to adjust a single thing. This block started naturally on March 23rd, and if we were to just run 4 week block after 4 week block going into July 12th, it lines up perfectly with meet day, and we do not need to touch a single thing. It's a very satisfying case where, it's pretty rare as a coach to see, but it feels really good and it's super easy, and that's why I, included it in this example, is because we do not need to touch a single thing. Everything just lines up perfectly, and it works out quite nicely. But you can kind of see this is a good visualization for what this is ultimately going to look like. Jake runs 4 week blocks. We're trying to get that final session of that final 4 week block to be meet day. And in order for us to do that, specifically with this block coincidentally starting on March 23rd, we do not need to touch a single thing timing or pacing wise. My next example is going to be Abby O. She will be competing on September 6th. And in order for us to do the same thing, it's going to be a little bit different. Abby also runs 4 week blocks. That's her typical pacing and training. But if we were to just run 4 week blocks from this start date here of April 27th, it does not line up coincidentally with meet day, which is September 6th. So we need to do something with that. So we had minus 1 week that we had to do something with. So AKA, we would need to shorten a block by 1 week in order to time things up with meet day. So following the general key points and guidelines here I have at the bottom, if we have an odd block that we need to adjust the pacing and the overall length of, I would prefer we get that out of the way sooner rather than later. So what I did was I have her normal block length here for this first block. I have her doing a 3 week block here, which is going to line up timing into meet day. And then I have her doing 3 4 week blocks for the remainder of prep, which is going to line up perfectly with meet day. So pretty simple solution there, and a really, really minor change that is going to ultimately impact things really positively, okay? I'm actually going to go, I'll bring up Mar as my last example, but Carlos is going to be my third example, and he's really similar to Abby, where he's going to be competing on October 18th, and he runs 5 week blocks. Now, this is where top set progression plays a role as well, and where we're placing macro cycles within that prep, especially when we're timing things out ahead of time. This is over 5 months of block timing planned out. So we're going to do for him, again, we've got 5 week blocks that we run with him. So it unfortunately doesn't coincidentally line up with meet day like Jake's does in his example, but we can do something really easy, which is just another one shortened block, and that should really just be the only solution that we need to make. So we're going to do a 5 week block that ends on June 14th, a 5 week block that ends on July 19th, And then we have a 3-week block here, which is going to line up timing with meet day. And you might be asking me in your head, why not do this 3-week block ahead of time? And this is where block pacing and top set progression has a little bit to do with it, right? If you're already in the middle of a macro cycle that you want to finish up in a predictable way, like I am with Carlos right now, I would prefer we finish that, and then when we start a new macro cycle, or perhaps go down to singles maybe, that's when we can coincidentally do that odd block. So in Carlos's case, I won't get too into detail with it because that's a bit more individual to him, but these 2 blocks to end prep here are going to be singles. That's tentatively where I have his top set progression planned out in the future. So I would prefer we actually take this 3-week block as a little bit of a chill period. Obviously take bigger weekly jumps, but understand that, hey, this 3-week block is probably going to be less predictable than a typical 5-week block because we don't do 3-week blocks in training. So let's get these, sets of 4, sets of 3, sets of 2 out of the way, which is typically how we progress things for him, mainly like a 3-2-1 progression, and then do this unpredictable block before we get into singles. So that was a little bit more of a nuanced strategic approach for him. It's just the timing of when we're placing that odd block, but for the most part, I like to get that out of the way ASAP. And then my last example is going to be Mar. And if you remember this 4th point here, when an athlete has 2 meets that are close together, I would prefer that first post-meet block to be a normal length for the athlete. And then considering the first point here, when we have a little bit of odd block pacing, I would prefer that we get that out of the way ASAP, because we do not want an adjusted block, or again, in Mar's case here, she typically will run those 5-week blocks. If we have a 3-week block that we need to do something with, I would prefer we get that out of the way as soon as we can, so it's not close to meet day and we don't actually run that 3-week block into meet day, or run that 3-week block before her final penultimate block, or whatever it may be. We're trying to get that out of the way as soon as we can, but she was just coming off of a meet in this example. So I would prefer we do not take that 3-week block right after she competes, just for the sake of getting back into some routine training, which I think can be good for the lifter's mental, and also just kind of seeing how any prospective post-meet changes go with a normalized block length. So with her, the approach we took was, I just called this post-meet block for the sake of the example, but we had this 5-week block after she competed, a 3-week block after that. Again, we just had these, we needed to do a shortened block in order to line up time with meet day. Got that out of the way as soon as we could. Had another 5-week block, and then just gonna have that final 5-week block going into meet day, which is gonna line everything up and be meet day essentially on that final Saturday for her. So I hope all that made sense. Again, it's pretty rare to see a Jake situation here where things just naturally line up. It's always awesome when that happens because we don't need to have like this awkward block to do something with. And if you guys have made it this far in the video, definitely give my video on testing tapering and peaking approaches in training a watch, because in cases that we need to do these shortened blocks, say a 3-week block, a 2-week block, all 3 of these examples, Abby, Carlos, and Mar, all had coincidentally a 3-week block in this example, but say we've got like a 2 or 3 week period that we need to do something with, and it's a shortened block because we've adjusted block pacing and timing into meet day, it can be a really good idea sometimes to use that awkward period of training to experiment around with, a little bit of a taper on deadlift, maybe a little bit of an extra push somewhere, or removing accessories during that final block on bench to see how the lifter's bench responds to that. So just kind of taking advantage of that. But there are multiple strategies you can take for these little bit of shorter blocks. But if you have made it this far, definitely give that experimenting with a little bit of a training taper video a watch, because that can be really helpful in situations like this. But yeah, beyond that, I hope the general premise of this video made sense, in the sense that, again, we're just trying to heighten predictability for meet day at the end of the day, and we need to do so as soon as we can. It's always good to plan ahead of time, especially when it comes to block pacing, which, again, in my opinion, is one of the most important variables when it comes to peaking for a powerlifting meet. So that being said, let me know if you've got any questions in the comments, and I'll see you guys at the next video.